Hello there, YouTube. Today we're going to cover more Tiny Rogues content for month of Tiny Rogues. Today we're not actually doing any, or this video at least, we're not doing any Cinder 16 gameplay. Instead, we're going to start looking into more discussion topics, and I plan to do quite a bit of this for Tiny Rogues. And today we're going to be looking at Resolute technique. More specifically, when is it good? My answer, most times in the game, it's very hard to accidentally make Resolute technique bad, but especially during the early game where your critical hit chance is low, it's pretty much a no-brainer. And to sort of help support that, I have a bit of a calculator here where we have our base crit chance of 5%, we have our base crit multi of 200%, and then we have the ability to add bonus crit chance or our intelligence, which is essentially bonus crit chance, or any bonus crit multiplier that we may have. We put in our top and bottom and damage off of our weapon, and with that, it'll calculate our average damage, and then therefore multiply that into our chance to crit by the average damage by our critical multiplier, or in other words, when we crit, what is our average damage across an aggregate, and then it'll also take the average damage and then multiply it by our chance to not crit, because that's what we're going to deal the rest of the time. Then it'll add those two together so that we get 100% at an aggregate of our critical damage, and then that will then compare against crushing damage, which, for those of you who don't know, a crushing hit just deals whatever the top end of your damage is, which is also why this is highlighted here. Now, thankfully, because a lot of Tiny Rogues is just a bunch of different multiplicative bins, we can actually, usually, in cases like this, actually compare two different mechanics together, because in most cases, any other multipliers that you have going on usually don't affect what's going on at all. If an enemy is shocked, it doesn't matter because we're still dealing damage with crits or without crits. It doesn't usually matter what percent you have on your weapon scaling, and it usually doesn't matter what percent increased damage you have. Now, this weapon that I have right here is just an example that I had on hand. This is a Divine Lance +6 that I had in another run. The reason why I used this is because it's physical damage, and I would even say most cases in the game, you will see a distribution like this, where your bottom end damage is just barely under half of your top end damage. You're going to see this on most forms as physical damage. You're going to see this on, I believe, cold damage. Radiant damage follows this. However, on other sources of damage, they might be considerably different. Notably, I believe poison and nature damage are usually closer together, and lightning damage is usually much farther apart, and we'll discuss why that's important later. So in this example here, we have our base critical chance multi, and we have no intelligence. So if for whatever reason we were to find this Lance +6 with the Divine Enchant just in the first room, this is pretty much what we would be looking at here. Of course, I have a whole bunch of other damage in here to get these numbers, but again, most of that isn't relevant. So, in this instance, crushing damage is dealing somewhere around 25% more damage than I normally would, which makes it a pretty good pick. I would go ahead and say that each time that you pick a trait, you generally want to increase your damage by around 20%. Obviously, some of them are more equal than others, some of them require a little bit more help than others. Now, generally speaking, I would say that you get around 60 stats on average in a run, or at least I do. And generally speaking, you're going to have a more even distribution of stats, but if I'm not actively trying to increase a stat, I usually end up with somewhere around 10 to 15. So if we go ahead, add that intelligence into there, then we're going to end up with more aggregate crit damage, but overall Crushing damage is still generally better, but at this point it's at like a 10%. So, like I said, during the early game when you don't have intelligence, it's really hard to make Resolute Technique bad. Fortunately, we have access to obsidian dice, which allow you to reroll traits, so if at any point you accidentally make Resolute Technique bad, then you can go ahead and reroll off of it. Another example that I would like to add is that on one of my runs, I had a necromancer that had access to barbarism and 60 strength. So that gave me 300% extra crit multi. And at that point, let's go ahead and add some, and then just go ahead and add a couple of skeletons in here, which would give us another 15% crit chance likely. And then obviously at this point, yes, it would be worse for us to be using Resolute Technique. However, I would also state that again, we're looking at an endgame situation where I have picked Barbarism because I had 60 strength. I wouldn't normally say that a character should gain 60 strength unless you're seriously going out of your way. I believe even in that situation I had access to Mega Nords, which gives you plus 30 by itself, so considering that that was most of my critical multiplier there, then I would still be at like 150% critical multiplier. But again, we're still running into the same situation here where a majority of our decisions up to the point of endgame made it to where Resolute Technique was bad. And in fact, in this build, I took the exact opposite. I took, what is it called? Pack Mentality, which is you always roll the low end damage and then you get an additional, like, 1 companion slot because that gave me an additional 3 skeleton archers, which suddenly brings my crit up even more. Now, again, in reality, I actually had significantly more critical chance than this, but again, just looking at a situation and showing numbers there to help make a point there that I had to go severely out of my way in order to make that happen. Now, one thing that might happen to you, especially early in the game, is you might run into the black market, and the black market has a whole bunch of exclusive enchants that can be on weapons in there, one of which is illegal, and that is 15% crit. And so if you have a 15% crit weapon, and let's even say that you buy the spider minion or the spider companion from there and use that to get some extra critical chance, which you could have 2 for 25 each. At that point, your aggregate crit damage is equivalent to your crush damage. Again, I probably wouldn't take Resolute Technique in this case because of the fact that at this point, crushing damage is only increasing your damage by about 10%. And you need better, well, it's actually less than 10%. It's something like 5%. You need better traits than that. Another thing that I would like to note is that it's actually quite hard in the game, besides obviously with Barbarism and a really roided build, to get critical multiplier. Notably, I believe it's Thief has like an extra 50% because it's wearing a set. Some weapons will give you extra critical multiplier. And there's also a debuff called Fatigue, which will make enemies take more damage from critical strikes, which is technically separate from all this because it's not actually critical multiplier. I would say that it's somewhat easy to reliably get more critical chance because you can scale your intelligence. Again, you can always try and fish for an illegal weapon. And technically, we haven't discussed it here, lucky hit chance is also theoretically critical hit chance. Now, we've definitely given a lot of examples onto why Resolute Technique is honestly pretty close to critting in a moderate amount of value, but I think we also should probably discuss the point where Resolute Technique is significantly better than crits. Most notably, Goat Force, or any source of Ruthless, which raises the top end damage, any source of instability that raises the top end damage, and then there's also another trait called Fighter's Mark that will increase top end damage as well while you have it. Now, Goat Force has one of those very wide distributions, like I was saying before, even before you consider the fact that it's a ruthless hit. And my highest tooltip for Goat Force that I've managed to get is, or actually at like top level with just 35% bonus damage from strength, you're going to have a Goat Force that looks like this. Now, if I go ahead and add some of that business that we were talking about before, we go ahead, we even add Best Friends Forever and double the effect of our two spiders. And at that point, it's comparable. We go ahead and take off that Best Friends Forever there, maybe even add some intelligence to our build. That's starting to become comparable. This is without looking at the fact that Goat Force is a ruthless hit. So we go ahead and we double this top end damage, which would be, oh dear now, 66.94. And at this point, crushing damage is still competitive with critting, despite the fact that we're putting everything else into other things. This is also not counting that in this run that I'm mentioning, I also had access to instability, which increases the top end damage that I deal and the bottom end damage that I deal by an additional 30% more. That's kind of insane because obviously that gives crushing damage 30% more damage, and aggregate crit is going to lose some damage or probably stay about the same now that I think about it. On top of that, again, Fighter's Mark. The actual highest tooltip that I managed to get which was with a Fighter's Mark with some dominance, which increased the effect of buffs on me, was 500 or 5,649. And at this point, our disparity is so large that it is actually difficult for us to, with this, I would say medium, but again, like depending on how much investment you're looking at here, this is still going to absolutely blow away everything that you have. And this is actually not counting, again, the fact that it's a ruthless hit. So, another thing, the reason why I bring this up is because, again, lightning damage follows this formula too. In fact, it'll have something absolutely ridiculous, like 27 in this. Or more specifically, let me go ahead and grab an actual example. This is a very low level discharge. However, it looks like this. So even with this moderate amount of critical investment, just base lightning damage, we're still not able to basically beat it with crushing hits. And in fact, it is 20%. Is it? Yeah, it's 20% more damage. So I would take this. So basically, as a takeaway, if you're playing any build that is utilizing lightning damage, or if you notice that your bottom end damage is significantly less than half of your top end damage, you got access to Fighter's Mark, you got access to instability. Obviously, if you have the Boar Companion, which deals bonus damage to crushing hits, all that stuff, then you might want to actually take a look out for Resolute Technique when it comes up. And as a side note, I've left out, for the most part, lucky chance and curse hit chance out of this equation due to the fact that I honestly do not know how they work. I've got a very good idea, but knowing how they actually work in game and especially in tandem with each other, it will also like significantly affect like the end results. But to sort of like tack it on there, lucky hit, if you have 100% lucky hit chance, then you always roll twice for crits and use the higher result. Therefore, your chance of not critting is 1 minus your critical chance times 1 minus your critical chance. So in other words, if you had 20% critical strike chance, then you would multiply 0.8 by 0.8, and your chance to crit would then be somewhere around 36%. Again, even on that point where you've got moderate crit investment, but 100% lucky hit chance for some reason, which I suppose is actually relevant due to something like Unicorn Horn, or Radiant Damage is another good example. But even in that instance, it wouldn't end up flipping our decision here with crushing damage versus crits on lightning damage. Anyways, that's our discussion about Resolute technique. Was hoping that it would end up being a much shorter video so that I could also get another video in here. Hopefully I explained everything reasonably well enough. If you have any questions or you feel like I missed anything out and you want to put that into the conversation, be sure to leave those down in the comments below, as well as any other feedback such as questions, comments, concerns, misplay alerts. As usual, you can put those down there too. If you have other questions that you would maybe want me to look into, feel free to put those down there. And until next time, I'll catch you guys around.